Hello and welcome. Welcome to our premiere event of the Spring 2021 Music Talks and Tea Events, hosted by Hunter College Department of Music. Today, we are pleased to present Ukrainian hip hop in the world. Leah Batstone is a musicologist specializing in the intersections of art music, philosophy, and politics in fin de siècle Austria and 20th century Ukraine. She is currently working a book project about Ukrainian art music of the past 100 years as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Vienna. Before the start of her fellowship, she taught in the Hunter College Music Department as a member of the music history faculty, and in summer of 2021, she will be teaching a special topics course in opera studies focusing exclusively on the works of African American composers at Hunter. Professor Batstone will be moderating this afternoon's event. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you, Brad. It's great to be here. And thanks so much to everyone who is in attendance, both here in Zoom and also on the YouTube Live. I just want to say a quick thank you to the music department and to the Russian and Eastern European Cultures program at Hunter who are co-hosting this event. And just to let people know that wherever you're watching, please feel free to submit questions at any point in the chat, either on YouTube or in Zoom. And we will be monitoring those questions, and there'll be time for Q&A at the end of the presentations. So today's event is something I'm really excited about. It is a discussion with Dr. Adriana Helbig, Dr. Maria Sonovitsky, and Dr. Galina Yarmanova about hip hop in Ukraine and the role of this music in the country's contemporary history, especially around issues of politics, class, and gender. So I'm really excited to share this repertoire. Ukrainian hip hop is wonderful. I hope maybe we'll have some converts after this presentation who will add some Ukrainian artists to their Spotify playlists. So we're gonna start with the presentation by Dr. Helbig. So Dr. Helbig is an associate professor of music and the present acting chair of music, and the former assistant dean of undergraduates at the University of Pittsburgh, where she teaches courses on world music, global hip hop, Romani music, music and disability studies, prison sounds, and bluegrass. She's a recipient of fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Councils for International Education, and Fulbright. She's the author of Hip Hop Ukraine, Music, Race, and African Migration, which came out in 2014, and the co-editor of Hip Hop at Europe's Edge, Music Agency and Social Change, which came out in 2017. Her most recent book, which is called Resounding Poverty, Romani Music and Development Aid, analyzes the impact of foreign funding on musical repertoires of impoverished Roma in the Transcarpathian region of Ukraine. It's really good to have you, Adriana. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Leah. And actually, as I'm listening to my bio, the only thing I keep thinking of is most of the time I was just trying to find how to get from one place to another in a country that has really gone through such incredible change in the last 20 years. So I congratulate you on your accomplishments. This is fantastic. I love seeing the next generation of scholars and everything you've accomplished. So thank you. Thank you to Hunter College, Department of Music, Reese, and welcome Maria Sonovitsky. It's always a pleasure to be on a panel with you, and Galina Yarmanova as well. So today, actually, let me just share my screen and get us going here. So today I want to basically walk us through the history of Ukrainian hip hop. And the reason why I think I was almost taken aback by this biography that, of myself and of my colleagues is that Ukrainian research on popular music has skyrocketed in the last 10 years, and precisely because there have been so many changes and so many exciting changes in the popular music sphere. When we consider the history of Ukrainian hip hop, we actually have to consider it in the context of numerous other genres. And so before I launch into this, I want to simply ask the question, what makes music political? And the reason why I ask this is because most music in Ukraine is political. It's politicized by either the musicians, by the audiences, by the producers, by government officials. Music has always been at the creative front of moving and changing things in Ukraine. And so when we analyze this music, we first look at the lyrics, we look at the content and the extent of social commentary. We look at symbolic language and references that sometimes only the musician and the audience can understand, so to subvert censorship. We look at the performance context. So are musicians performing on a public stage? Are they performing somewhere in private? Is this because, again, they are on a blacklist, which is typical for many musicians in Ukraine, especially in the history of those that were active during Soviet times, but also when we consider Ukraine having gone through two major revolutions in 2004 and 2014, and also the breakup of the Soviet Union that had musicians at the forefront. So performance context is crucial. The modes of production, are these musical forms, are they being recorded in studios? Are they government sanctioned studios, as in the Soviet context? Are they being disseminated and circulated through music industries or underground, as much music has been circulated in Ukraine? We also look to see whether the music reflects the performer's personal views, or if this performer is being paid on behalf and performing on behalf of somebody else. And so as is typical in Ukraine, there are lists sometimes published where politicians, the association between politicians and musicians becomes clear. And then we also just look to the extent to which the musicians push the boundaries of existing norms. So are they, whether they be social or political or economic, we look again to see that the musicians are always at the forefront. And this is not just for musicians, this is artists, this is in theater, and this is one of the particularities of creative research in Eastern Europe. So the music genres that I'll walk us through briefly, and you can see here, whether folklore, jazz, rock, pop, or hip hop, each of these dates that I've put in actually has the 1990s as a pivotal change. So something happens, especially in the early 1990s, and it's explained, of course, by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the transitions that each of the former Soviet republics undergoes. With Ukraine, it becomes very dramatic to the extent that Ukraine has always been one of the closely aligned, not so much closely aligned, but the power dynamics have been very specific with regard to Moscow and with regard to the Russian leadership with Ukraine. So we're thinking of folklore. There were very specific ways that Ukrainian folklore was altered and utilized by the Soviet regime: jazz, rock, pop, and hip hop. So I'll walk us through very briefly. With musical folklore, I won't spend too much time on this, but what's interesting is that folklore has come up now in numerous ways in all forms of popular music in Ukraine. So whether you're looking at rock, or whether you're looking at folk fusion, or Authentica, which is the collection of folklore from villages and the recreation in an authentic style. And again, I'll put it in scare quotes, but with great respect to my colleagues, of learning the specific styles that were prevalent in rural areas, especially before Soviet occupation. And the Soviet governments had very clear reasons for wanting to change some of that folklore. The reasons being the close ties that folklore has to land, ecology, religion, kinship. And so altering lyrics and altering places where folklore was performed altered the ways that people viewed folklore. Folklore is a way that some people refer to what then ended up on stages, but also this return to folklore. So we'll leave it at that. And I know it might sound a little bit cryptic, but as we show the examples, it'll become a little bit clearer. Jazz, very interesting that jazz plays a very important role on the development of hip hop in Ukraine. It's associated as an African-American genre. It starts to come into the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s. There is a very clear alignment of jazz with African-American histories, circulating into the Soviet Union through American musicians, but also those that are working in Paris at this time. We also have the introduction of new instruments. These instruments start to cause a lot of anxiety for Soviet officials, who then start to very seriously censor jazz in the Soviet Union. There's a lot of censorship of jazz also in Nazi Germany. So this motion of censoring jazz as something that is inappropriate, as moving the social norms beyond acceptable oral experiences is something that's very strong. By default, then, it positions jazz as a very strongly politicized genre. And that politicization of genres, you can see, is relational, because jazz becomes depoliticized in the 1990s. So once the Soviet Union collapses and the lack of tension comes into play, jazz starts to develop in completely different ways, not necessarily as anti-establishment as it is through most of Soviet history. Rock music. Much has been written about rock music bringing down the wall, bringing down the curtain, the Iron Curtain. With lyrics, it's very important because they become very overt. Much of rock music is very critical of the Soviet regime. Rock is politicized for many reasons. One is that even the use of instruments, and again, sort of comparing to the saxophone, right? The electric guitar, the synthesizer, when you have distorted sounds, these are sounds that again are sort of falling beyond the norms of acceptability with regard to Soviet censors. We have a lot of music, especially rock music, that is circulated on bootleg cassettes. So a lot's been written about Magnitizdat, right? Self-made copies of music that's recorded in apartments and circulated, and like-minded individuals then are in the know, right? And this in the know is very important because music becomes the delineating factor. Are you with us or are you against us? And for those who have never heard of Rock na Kostyach, I just always love to give this example of the LPs that are copied on X-ray discs. And some of the music that's copied comes from the West. So you'll see that there are different ways that rock is politicized because it's association with the West, but also there's a very local way that these rock aesthetics are appropriated. So where do all these genres go in 1990 in Ukraine? First, we have to consider the fact that the Ukrainian SSR, again, was closely intertwined with the Russian strongholds. So Moscow, St. Petersburg, the centers that controlled the music industry for all of the Soviet Union, also had very specific interests for Kyiv, partly because the word Ukraine means borderland, right? So it is the extension of the Russian Empire. So historically, Ukraine always had a much stronger interest for Moscow and the leaders than, not to say that other republics didn't, but there was, again, this very specific relationship. And so people living in Ukraine also had a very strong connection to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And when you're looking at this exchange and this collapse, what we have is a period of time where people simply are not able to produce, partly because of the shock of what's actually happening, partly because all of the venues where music was produced are now gone, right? So all the networks, the recording networks, the distribution networks are no longer in play. And this period, especially the early 90s, we see a drop in sort of official distributions of popular music. Unofficial distributions, right? Moving from Magnitsky in the USSR, we have piracy. So piracy at this time is through the roof. And Ukraine is one of the top countries at this time where there are illegally distributed compact discs. They're coming in from Europe. Much of this is music out of the West. And the black market is where music is circulated. Eventually, compact discs turn into MP3s, and that's where a lot of the music is then distributed. So unofficially, that is what's happening. Officially, we have people in power who are not necessarily interested in seeing Ukrainian language music on the radios or having representations of Ukrainian folk culture in a public sphere. These are people that are still strongly connected to the networks of the Soviet Union, and they we refer to them as oligarchs. Many of them, through great corruption, gain control of the media. And so as we've seen everything that's been happening in the United States recently, so when you have control of the media and fake news, a lot of things happen. And so much of this is what's actually happening in Ukraine in the 1990s, going into the early 2000s, which eventually leads to these revolutions of the 2000s. So it is in this context that we engage with hip hop for the first time. And we're looking at the late 1990s, and there's a group by the name of Tanok na Maidani Congo, Dance on Congo Square. They are one of the top groups that continues to be at the forefront of hip hop in Ukraine today. They're closer to my age than yours, but what's interesting about them is that they come from Eastern Ukraine. So Kharkiv, which is a city, a Russian-speaking city, very close to the Russian border. It's not necessarily a place that you would consider access to Western genres to be greater than somewhere else. One might think that the capital cities are the place where much of this is developed. And that is true, that Kyiv eventually emerges as the capital of the Ukrainian music industry. But at this time in the 1990s, it's very much people are trying to find connections among each other and to help each other out. And so in Kharkiv, we have this group that is very much aware of what is happening in European hip hop, which is very much aware of what is happening in US hip hop. They take as their name the reference to New Orleans Congo Square. And this is why I told you a little bit about jazz in the Soviet Union. So why would a hip hop group name themselves after a jazz reference. And part of this has to do with African American identity and how it's being circulated and perceived in Ukraine at this time. So when I talked about the Black market, one of the things that I wanted to articulate further was that the Black market was all about goods and products that were perceived to come from the United States. And part of this has to do with capital consumption. So logos and this kind of consumption that has to do with presenting oneself as being cosmopolitan, as moving beyond the limits on goods in the Soviet Union and being able to present oneself like this. And so with what is authentic American becomes synonymous with African American. And the idea is that a Black person speaking English becomes the symbol for what is American. And this is something that I write about extensively in my book, Hip Hop Ukraine. Actually, I have it here, so I'll show you. So you can see the cover is African musicians in Ukraine who are represented in the media as African Americans. So it's a very fascinating aspect of all of this, and I'm happy to address that in the question and answer. But in any case, so Tanak na Maidani Congo, referencing to Congo Square, and let's just see a little bit of this example. And you can see again, make me a hip hop. Make me a hip, make me a hop. But the references to the lyrics are very local, right? They're very village almost. I love Hryts. Hryts is a very rural name. It's a Ukrainian name. And what's interesting, again, that in this part of Eastern Ukraine that is mostly Russian speaking at this time, you have a group that is referencing African-American jazz identities using hip hop as a way to articulate themselves as Ukrainians. So I love Hryts. I only love Hryts because Hryts has half a strawberry in his pocket. And you can infer what this is. And at this time, one has to understand that there's a hypersexualization of gender. So men, the mafia image is very strong. For women, it almost goes into this idea of prostitution. At this time, many people are leaving Ukraine, and there is also especially for women, they're being sort of manipulated to leave, and they end up in the underground sex trade. So they're called Natashas, and so this is part of the stereotype of the gender stereotype that will be addressed in the second half. So let's just watch a little bit of this. You have one woman, she's silent. You see her body, and it's basically being sung on her behalf that she is desiring all of these young men. I did want to just point a little bit to the imagery that you see in this video. This is clearly, it's looking like a collapsed building or something is you know, in an urban decay type of context. Much of the countryside actually looks like this for a very long time, going into even the 2010s. And partly some of these buildings are the remnants of collective farms that people are no longer working at, factories, decay. Again, that urban decay is a very strong element of this. And so this reclaiming of the public space, but also hearkening to a lot of the hip hop videos coming out of the United States at that time, or even earlier, talking about the street and reclaiming the street. So again, this is just a little bit to have this as a comparison, and I'll move on in the interest of time. So in the 2000 Orange Revolution, rap is not at that time, the genre of choice. It just happens that rap starts to lend itself for easily sampling politicians' voices, protesters' voices, and it's there's also a lot more technology that starts to come around at this time, and the internet booms, right? So prior to 2004 in the Orange Revolution, and a part of this has to do with a stolen election, right? So again, quite similar to some of the stories that we've been going through recently. And basically, we have the sampling of musicians' voices in this. And the rap that we're going to hear is called Razom nas bahato, so Together We Are Many. And this was one of the appropriated chants for this a political event. You can see imagery of Kyiv, Maidan, and so this Independence Square becomes central to all of the political events in Ukraine. What's interesting about this example is that this is a political rap that eventually becomes, or the year after this, becomes the Ukraine's entry for the Eurovision contest. So again, when I said that all music in Ukraine is political, sometimes it gets politicized or the intent is political. So let's just hear a little bit of this. And this basically means, you know, the chant is Together We Are Many, we will not be defeated. And the chant is no lies, no corruption. And this is the first setup for what then happens 10 years after this.
Разом нас багато, нас не подолати. 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 Фальсифікаціям, махінація, поняття, ні брехні. Ющенко, Ющенко, це наш президент. Фальсифікаціям, махінація, поняття, ні брехні. Ющенко, Ющенко, це наш президент.
Okay, so Together We Are Many, we will not be defeated. And then the reference to no to corruption and yes to the candidate of the choice. What was interesting about this rap, again, you could see that the hip hop and rap, I mean, these labels are thrown onto songs that might not necessarily be marketed as such in another country. But you had everybody from an 80-year-old grandmother rapping this and singing this to somebody coming up the, you know, in their youth. So these are very formative events. So after this event in 2004, you see a Ukrainian language rap. You see this break from the oligarch control of the media for the first time. And this becomes a huge event in the history of the music industries in Ukraine. And so all of these other genres that really didn't have a niche yet or didn't have an opportunity to be explored now make it onto the screen. And so this next example is just a fusion example. It's rock, rap, and then a little bit of this folklore. What's interesting, again, in the role of women here, this is folklore. That's the lyrics are that my Cossack husband has sent me out into the snow barefoot. And so when we start to look at some of the folklore that's pre-Soviet that's being brought back, you know, there are some issues that start to come up with this. But here again, you have a very strict division between male and female, and you'll see again that the males are rapping and then the women are singing in this folk genre. And what's interesting in the study of folk music, the majority actually are women today in Ukraine. And again, we can address that a little bit later.
Визволить матінку Чорноморець, вивели мене босою, ой, на морозець, вивели мене босою, ой, на морозець, вивів мене босою, та й питає, чи є мороз дівчино, ой, чи немає, чи є мороз дівчино, ой, чи
So there's a lot going on in that video. And like I said, in terms of the imagery and being broad in the fusion genres, that's a very good example of sort of the creativity and the bringing of all these kinds of strands. Even though, again, the incorporation of the folklore really puts a very complex bent on it. On the other hand, it also shows where society was at the time. You know, we're talking about a country that really has gone through so much change. We have economic collapse, we have political change, we have revolution after revolution. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to actually talk about the Euromaidan. This actually happens a lot because I experienced PTSD from those images in 2014. So I will move ahead, but I do want to simply say that young people that were born in the 1990s, in the 2000s, what they have actually already experienced, what brings us after Euromaidan. And again, very similar imageries, although extreme violence. Crimea is annexed by Russia. There's still violence on the Eastern Front. We have I won't actually go into all of that because you can really read about all of that on your own. But this is where we're at. And I just wanted to end my presentation with Yarmak. And you can see with the lyrics that we're in a very different place, a very different headspace when it comes to hip hop today. It's a very authentic place. It's not appropriating, it's not fusing. And I'll just allow you to read it on your own, but simply to say that last line, a child grows up in a cold stone forest. The reference being to the spalni rayone, to the areas of town where there are very large high rises, food deserts, and basically the experiences that the parents of these children have gone through as well, right? So, you know, when your own youth continues to be taken away from you. And this is one of the things that I experienced a lot as a researcher in Ukraine. So in my 20s and my 30s, there were many women in their 30s and 40s at these hip hop clubs because they were among those whose youth was lost in the transition from the 80s to the 90s. Okay, so I will play just a little bit of this, but you can see right away that the dialogue to this video is the boy asks the father where the microphone is, and the father says, I don't know.
Я не понял, микрофон мой где?
Какой микрофон? Я не видел. Бля, может нас обокрали?
Ух и сука ты.
Че? Иди сюда, щенок!
Слышу треск, встала холка. Через лес, передвигаясь ловко. Я еще даже не понял, кто я толком. Холодный взгляд, клыки, как у волка. Эта среда учит держаться кучно. Из 10 семей то 9 неблагополучных. На небе снова многотучно. В этом дурдоме, сука, не бывает скучно. С кого пример тут брать? В этом квартале модно воровать, не врать. Ребенку страшно спать, старики
I
баш...
think in the interest of time, I'm going to end and simply say that that example was in Russian. The musician is out near Kyiv, and we see again just an expansion of the themes and the topics that are prevalent in Ukrainian hip hop today. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Yeah, and thank you. It's always a little bit weird on these Zoom calls when everyone's muted and you sort of stop talking and there's no response. But that was really fascinating, and I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of questions just in those few examples. There's so much richness and history and change. So our next presentation is a joint presentation by Dr. Maria Stanovitsky and Dr. Galina Yarmanova. So Maria Stanovitsky is an assistant professor of ethnomusicology at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research focuses primarily on post-Soviet Ukraine, where she's investigated topics such as discourses of sovereignty and wildness in post-Soviet Ukrainian popular music, folklore revivals after state socialism, and the effects of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster on the revival of rural musical repertoires. In 2015, Smithsonian Folkways released the project, the Chernobyl Songs Project, Living Culture from a Lost World, which she helped to produce. And her first book, Wild Music, Sound and Sovereignty in Ukraine, was published in October of 2019, and it just won the 2020 Lewis Lockwood Award from the American Musicological Society, which is just a really great honor, and very excited that a book about Ukraine has won that prize. So congratulations, Maria. Dr. Galina Yarmanova teaches feminist and queer theory at the sociology department at Kyiv Mohyla Academy. She edited and co-authored collective research publications called Gender, Nationalism, and Religion in Ukraine and LGBT Families in Ukraine. She also co-edited the textbook on gender theory called Gender for Media, together with Maria Mayerchik and Olga Plakhotnik. Her current research collaboration focuses on sexualities in late Soviet Ukraine and includes a short documentary film called The Wonderful Years, which is co-directed with Svetlana Shymko from 2018. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for inviting us to present today. Welcome everyone. Adriana, thank you very much for your presentation. We will talk about something a little bit different. Since their emergence in the Ukrainian music sphere in recent years, Alona, and Alina Pash, two women rappers from Ukraine, have attracted considerable media attention for putting powerful and also often non-normative images of Ukrainian womanhood into circulation through their bold hip-hop in Ukrainian. And both rappers also foreground images of rurality and folk femininity. And today, we will observe how both rappers thematize ideas about class, gender, and body politics in their music, and in what Alona has described as rap for the village. And also in turn how they're depicted through media narratives. And we argue that from one perspective, their feminist slant has enabled a shapeshift in body politics, one that refuses oppressive normative body expectations from women, while simultaneously asserting cis heteronormative femininities that reproduce some of the very same constraints that they seem to want to challenge. And similarly, both demonstrate a sensitivity to politics of class in post-Soviet Ukraine, while at times seeming to exoticize poverty and rurality for non-Ukrainian viewers.
So this is a new project for us and a new collaboration for us. So we're going to aim to give some broader context and overview rather than a deep lit review, with a focus today especially on these axes of gender and class. So I'm just going to go ahead and anticipate the question of why we aren't focusing on race, which Dr. Hedvig so nicely kind of teed up for us. And there are a few reasons for this. One is that in evaluating different media narratives, Anglophone and Ukrainian Russian media narratives, what really jumps out are the politics of gender and class and the way that those things are talked about. And perhaps the absence of race in those narratives is itself a story that we will eventually tell. So I want to say also that in the future, we do intend to take that on more fully and would definitely welcome questions about more directly about race in the Q&A today.
So for this presentation today, first we would like to introduce Alona and Alina Pash, examining contrasting Ukrainian and Russian language versus Anglophone media narratives about them. And what we will show is some friction in how these artists are depicted as feminist, as political, as activists, also as coming from the village, depending on which public they're speaking to. And then we will show you a video of their collaboration on a song called Padlo, which roughly can be translated as jerk in English. And we'll try to tease out how some of these tensions are thematized and presented in this work.
Yeah, so we'll start with Alona, who is perhaps one of the most well-known popular music artists in Ukraine right now. And what I did here is create a word cloud based on a number of Anglophone media narratives about Alona. So I want to highlight just a few themes that emerge when observing these narratives. The first is her size, that she is a plus size icon. And this appears maybe most prominently in much of the media because it appeared in an article that was widely syndicated around the world, from India to the UK, to France, to other locations around the world. So her plus size, the size of her body, is a really big theme, and twinned with body positivity, or fat positivity, which is equated to a form of feminist activism. And in general, she is then linked to a number of other social justice causes. And the thing I want to emphasize in these narratives is that the kind of political activism here is not presented in Anglophone media narratives as especially fraught. It's sort of legible, familiar to us as Anglophone speakers, perhaps in ways that we would understand existing feminisms. Another dominant theme that recurs, and you can see this in the up left corner here, is that she was a kindergarten teacher. This recurs in media narratives, Anglophone media narratives about Alona. She's a kindergarten teacher, and this feeds into this kind of feminized idea of care. She repeats herself in multiple interviews, quote, I'm a kindergarten teacher, not a gangster. So again, kind of a racialized trope for sure, also signaling some of that racial anxiety. And then another pervasive trope in these Anglophone media narratives is the idea of, quote unquote, the village, as though there were something so static. So the idea of the village is presented in a kind of unproblematic way, that this is a rapper from the village who speaks for the village. And we can trouble the ease of that idea when we look at the other narratives. And then the last point I want to make is that her language choice is a recurring theme in a lot of Anglophone media narratives. And the fact that she raps in Ukrainian is a story that is told everywhere. This is explicitly connected to the Maidan, from what I could tell, to the Maidan revolution in these Anglophone media narratives. So her choice to rap in Ukrainian is presented as a decision born out of this moment of intense political upheaval. And this is also a very convenient narrative for Western audiences to consume, a sort of flattened idea of what was happening on the ground there. So this is also tied into her language choice is politicized, as a fact of the kind of self-actualization of Ukraine, that this is a symptom of Ukraine and Ukrainian popular music really finding itself. And so that will be the last point I make about Anglophone media narratives.
Ukrainian and Russian language media narratives contrast in some places, overlap in others, but generally they give much more nuance, I think, because there's no need to explain the general context or to to explain where she's coming from to the people who read it in Ukraine. And so the fact that she is a woman rapping is a recurring theme. On the one hand, she coordinated this big women in rap online community for some time, and she opposes herself in some interviews. She opposes herself as someone who writes real rap, as contrasted to most of the women in rap who write like the typical women in rap writing sappy tracks about love and heartbreak. But at the same time, she is of course celebrated by the feminist community here as someone who is popularizing women in rap, and she received awards for this as for instance, awards from UN Women and so on. So she's someone who works with gender issues also because she is a woman who raps in itself, right? And so the regular person trope is similar to Anglophone narratives, but at the same time, there is more diversity about her professional background. There's a lot of materials that she was also part of low-paid but honorable jobs, not just as a kindergarten teacher, but also as a social worker, as a cashier, in the store. And so her political work on topics such as environment, as gender-based violence, as anti-bullying, comes a lot as an exploration of the social injustices that she's seen, but still from this very clear perspective of a regular person who's seen a lot of suffering, and not necessarily as a activist. And we find that this is one of the most extreme contrasts in the media narratives, that she actually at some point she says, я и есть представитель бодипозитива, крути не крути, но я не лидер и не какой-то там суперактивист. Basically, she is saying to the Esquire journal in Russian that she is not a super activist or a leader, even though she represents body positivity ideas. And at the same time, the language politics are also not as directly tied to Maidan, and are more naturalized. Her Ukrainian lyrics are more naturalized as a sort of very natural thing to do now, and which doesn't need necessarily an explanation, even though she rapped before in Russian for some time, and she also uses Al-Qaeda nickname before that she kind of distances herself from. And this is also something we might want to explore later. And generally, there is this narrative about demonstrating to Europe who we are. She talks a lot about her tattoo, that she has a tattoo on her right arm, and she holds mic in her right arm during the concerts. And this is a tattoo of Petrikivsky Rospis, which is like this Ukrainian style of painting. And she says that with that, she wants to show who we are as Ukrainians, that we are awesome, socially oriented and modern, and that it's clear right away for her audiences internationally that where she comes from. We want to show you her breakout hit, Rybki, meaning fish. This is a video that went viral and that made her very popular. And you will see that this is a video with extremely limited budget, that, for instance, on the motorbikes, that you will see, it says motorbikes for rent and a phone number that you can call to get it. And so at the same time, we want to explain a little bit about the metaphor of fish she uses as a title. She at some point she explained this as something against slut shaming, or that fish is about being an outsider, or being perceived only as a sexual object. There was also debate in lesbian circles whether this was feminist lesbian song, where a woman talks about other women, or fish as a genitalia, which is used derogatory but also can be reclaimed. And we just want to give you a little taste of her work, and we will just show you first 35 seconds of this video.
Чуєш, моряк? Пливи, пливи сюди, пливи, пливи сюди. Мої рибки за склом, рибки за склом, так, рибки за склом. Рибки, 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 мої рибки за склом, рибки за склом, так, рибки за склом. Рибки, 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 рибу не лякає шерсть, мою рибу не назве ніхто шкурою. Риба там десь має честь, вона плаває під водою у раю.
So just a brief kind of taste of what that Rybki was like. And then shortly on the heels of Rybki, I guess number 1, we have Rybki number 2, produced in the same year. We won't show you a clip, but I just froze 2 stills from this. And I think what I want to highlight here is that Rybki 2 was presented as within the frame of a kind of absurd children's television programming called Children's Time. And when I first viewed it, it conjured for me the aesthetics of like the Zach Galifianakis comedy Between Two Ferns. If you've seen that, it has a kind of similar absurdism to it, where the host of the program is interviewing Alona, and they show a blooper reel basically of that, and then she raps for an audience of school children, and she does the Rybki rap for these school children. The question of why it was important to rehearse this song or reframe this song in this way is one that we considered, and we thought it might be in part due to the fact that there was some backlash to the first video and the fact that she was so proudly displaying her body in that swimsuit and on the jet ski. So you can see here that she's performing a kind of respectability politics that is also at the same time deeply absurd. She's rapping for this public of school children. Okay, moving on. So we'll talk a little bit about Alina Pash, and I did the same thing here, which is I created a word cloud, although this is a little bit less robust in the sense that there are fewer Anglophone media narratives about Alina Pash, who is the other rapper we want to talk about. There are a few things I want to highlight here. The first is the fact that Alina Pash comes from Transcarpathia or Zakarpattia. She's from Buștino in Zakarpattia, very close to the Romanian border. And so the fact of her regional identity, which is also closely associated with a rural identity, is pervasive in Anglophone narratives. Even though she went to college, she went to circus school in Kiev, but her roots in Transcarpathia, which are also on full display in her first hit, which we'll listen to in a little bit, is a real recurring theme. Another is her journey, which included that she wanted for a long time to be a police officer, which is what her father was, but then eventually decided to be a performer. The narrative of self-actualization, again, of kind of Ukrainians realizing themselves that this is a representation of a new generation of Ukrainians finding their voices, is another recurring theme here, that Alina Pash is the representative of this new generation of Ukrainians finding their place in the world. And then I'll just highlight also that bitanga, which is this word in purple, sort of on the bottom quadrant of the diagram, bitanga, which means hooligan in Transcarpathian dialect, was her breakout hit, and it uses a term associated with Zakarpatska hovirka, or I'm translating that as dialect here. And again, we'll listen to that shortly.
In Ukrainian language and Russian language media narratives about Alina Pash, there's a lot of mentioning that she was a runner-up in X Factor, and that she played with pop singers. And so she's celebrated as this person bringing innovation to the music and also bringing international fame to Ukrainian music through merging hip hop with transcribing folklore. But it's also clear that this choice for her is quite strategic. She says that in order to be internationally successful, and that it's important to be internationally successful because Ukrainian music industry is not as necessarily big as she would like to, that it's important to stand out and to bring something more interesting to the international audiences. And for instance, Daha Braha is a group that has this niche. And so it's quite clear that she's also working with this idea of women's empowerment. She talks about how she is пацанка зі зразкової сім'ї, a tomboy from a model family, and that this image of princess was imposed on her, but she rejected it. At the same time, her heterosexuality is reassured in in most of her work. But she works with this idea of strong womanhood, strong women, and this is in the context where there are a lot of books and general images about strong women, strong girls. Good night stories for rebel girls come out in Ukrainian before she makes her breakout hit. And so it's interesting that she works explicitly with the topics such as sexism and feminism and LGBT friendliness, but she is careful not to overstate the radicalism of her politics in Ukrainian and Russian media narratives. And she's also distancing herself from rhetorics of nationalism and patriotism. At the same time, she's associated with rapping for the President Zelensky during the International Day concert a couple years ago.
So in 2019, Alina Pash has her breakout hit with this rap song called Bitanga, and we'll just play a 1-minute clip for you, and it's a slightly longer clip only because I really wanted to include the Sopilka solo that enters towards the end, and that is a very clear sonic marker, again, of Zakarpattia and neighboring regions that are associated with this particular kind of wooden flute sound. So you'll hear that here. Okay.
Ой, пустіть мій татко добрий, музика там грає файно, йо. Уже всі звізди зазорялись, чека на мене там Іванко. Кучері крутила, щоб усім любила, цвіте червоненьке мамчиня. Швари широченькі, шимбала фененька, а вікна вся фігня. Ай, ну пустіть, я не філю, мене чекає вже біля села. Я знаю, там я нечесний бітанга, він мене може не раз і не два. Ай, ну пустіть, я сьогодні тусую, ніч не студена, і я не мала. Ай, ну пустіть, або я піду, з оболока. Пустиня. Ні. Пустишня.
Shoot. Should have just kept playing it. Okay. So we've introduced Alona and Alina Pash through these media narratives that in some places are compatible and in some places are in some tension. And now we want to turn to the kind of core example that we're going to talk about, which is the song Padlo that was mentioned before. We're going to translate Padlo here as jerk, although you'll see other pejoratives stand in for that term here. And I think we're going to show you the entirety of this video. But before we do that, we wanted to point out some things to listen for and consider as you listen, in some cases, probably for the first time to this. So a few things. The first is the narrative. This is really a kind of sci-fi narrative. The story of the video was written by Alina Pash's French partner, but the rap itself was composed by Alona and featured on her record Pushka. It's set in the year 2049, which may be a reference to Blade Runner 2049, for those familiar, in a place called Patriarchalny Chornobydlograd, in basically an urban apocalypse landscape. And the term that they use, Patriarchalny Chornobydlograd, is also a kind of classist way to indicate that this is a urban apocalypse cityscape populated by uneducated people. So the narrative goes that powerful female strength can redeem the world, and that women's destiny, in fact, is to make the world a better place. This happens when women are called to this apocalyptic zone to determine sort of the next appointee who will redeem the world. This happens through the bird of destiny, a magical chicken that lays eggs with magical information that will restore balance to the world. And so this kind of chicken trope is also an index of rurality, and is also intimately connected to a recurring image of the pisanka, or the Easter egg, which is also closely associated with Ukrainian folk arts.
You will also see matriarchy tropes in this video. That the video invokes intergenerational Ukrainian matriarchy. There's reference to Berehinya and Hestia, which is Ukrainian Greek references to women guardians, domestic icons, hearse bearers. There's also imagery of Pesanki, eggs, Easter, like as a springtime renewal, fertility, Christianity, and there's one of the video creators said that there's this phrase that every day will be like an Easter, and this is, he says, is a national Ukrainian nirvana, because at Easter nobody is sad, everyone is warm, and it's all very tasty, and this is a big celebration in a family circle. And so matriarchy here is folkloric and rural in nature, and it's grounded in a rural idea of femininity, but we will say more after we watch the video.
Yeah, great. And the last things we just want to highlight are two kind of vocal strategies that occur in this video. The first is for people familiar with Ukrainian folk music, the very first voice you hear is Nina Matvienko's voice. This is a really iconic voice of Ukrainian music, crossover into popular music, but closely associated with a kind of folk femininity. In a Sluch Media article about this video, Nina Matvienko is referred to as the mega Berehinya of the universe. So even though she's not singing here, the fact of the inclusion of her voice is signifying this kind of intergenerational, matriarchal folk femininity. And then the last thing I want to call attention to is the way that the chorus sounds. The chorus, which you'll be hearing a lot, it repeats frequently, is really merging, to my ears, hip-hop production strategies, especially a lot of auto-tune, with a kind of rural texture and vocality. So in particular, a lot of very close intervals. So that's something else that you can pay attention to as you listen.
We will show you the video with subtitles, and I was subtitling it yesterday, and in the process of subtitling, I was also thinking about the gap between this video narrative created by Nathan Daisy, and the lyrics, the song text from Alona. And we will focus mostly on the video narrative, although if you can pay attention to this and see how there is explicit fat pride and agency, and this idea of women's rap as sacral and something that has authority, which is not necessarily reflected closely in the video.
Рік 2049. Патріархальний Чорнобидлоград. У місті зникають чоловіки. Берегині Гестії з'явилися, щоб відшукати обрану, яка отримає дар птахи долі та жіночу волю зробити світ кращим.
знаходимося на місці, де через 20 хвилин обраний отримає магічну писанку. І ти майже там. Тут відчувається особлива небезпека, захист приміщення. Але всі чекають лише одного прибуття угрупування.
Вона тут! Вона наближається! Бігом! Бігом!
Хто там сказав на мамку падло, кому жить набридло, зараз ляже на дно. Хто там сказав на мамку падло, крашу писанки я, як Пікассо Пабло. Підстелю твій плей репіт, ти віриш в мене, ти не єретик. Я твоє слово, твій дагеротип, хай нитки рвуть, зашиті роти. Мій об'єм росте, числа Фібоначчі, хитає люд, мов дитячий м'ячик. А хто там схуд, я несу поживне, в голодний піст, моє слово жирне. Ей, хто там має збитий приціл, я хочу сісти, треба пара стільців. Я відкрила рот і мені аплодують, поглянь на мене, хіба в репі не годують. Хитаю задом, хитаю зали, зі мною в ліфті, хтось другий зайвий. Я сію слово, ділюся взайми, читаю так, щоб всі ви знали. Хто там сказав на мамку падло, кому жить набридло, зараз ляже на дно. Хто там сказав на мамку падло, крашу писанки я, як Пікассо Пабло. Всякі бувають дівки, Моналізи, Мадонни, зірки, шукають оригінал, але копій вже було завал. Я листаю новини, там стільки свинини, вам далеко до справжній паш. Ти грібів, купити мій персонаж.
Піднялася рибка і сама одна, залізла на гору сама. Казали, не вийде, бо дупа мала, та мала послала і крала.
Роблю своє, апдейтю твій слух, прокачую дух, шиковно ай. Хто там сказав на мамку падло, кому жить набридло, зараз ляже на дно. Хто там сказав на мамку падло, крашу писанки я, як Пікассо Пабло. Хто там сказав на мамку падло, кому жить набридло, зараз ляже на дно. Хто там сказав на мамку падло, крашу писанки я, як Пікассо Пабло.
Врешті берегині передали обрані знання, як влаштовано світ зовні й всередині. І тепер вона має потужну жіночу силу. І кожен день буде їй, як Великдень.
That moment when the pisanka sings always gets me. So to just further pull on a few threads here, we want to situate some of our interpretations in existing scholarship, including our own scholarship.
So we find Maria Majerčík research on the role of erotic folklore in the invention of modern sexuality very relevant. Majerčík talks about how romantic nationalism constructs folklore, народна культура, which could be roughly translated as folklore, as the basis for the nation, as the essence of the nation, and how it constructs it as pure, as not corrupted by urban decay yet, but at the same time emancipated from this wild promiscuity of the nature. And this imagery of traditional rural roots, Ukrainian rural roots, as something pure and an essence of the nation, is also invoked a lot in the current right-wing nationalist depictions. And research on neo-traditionalism shows how these ideas are popular in the recent backlash, which sometimes is called anti-gender movement, but basically broader describes religious right organizing, which is anti-gender, anti-abortion, anti-gay, and is quite popular in the Eastern Europe and in Ukraine in particular, and is also often related to the rise of the Christian right in the United States and throughout the world, and to the ideas of white supremacy. And so in this neo-traditionalist conservative rhetoric, LGBT movement and feminism are said to emasculate men and to threaten family and nation itself. And so the logic goes that feminism is not necessarily for Ukraine, because Ukraine, as opposed to Russia, has always been a matriarchy. And so the logic, by this logic, the solution is lies in a return to our traditional roots from this invented mythology. And so this becomes an answer to Russian imperialism, but also Western colonialism. And this is an argument for Ukrainian exceptionalism. And you can see in the beginning in this video where the narrator, Nina Matvienko, the great matriarch of the country, says that men are disappearing. And we read this as this refrain of the right wing, that there are no real men left. And so we think this thematizes this anxiety. And so this recovering a historical pastoral female power, in part through the magical chicken, otherwise known as a bird of destiny, and Pysanka, here is seen as a great solution, as a hope for the future.
And the last point it grows out of my own work from my first book, Wild Music, this idea of sovereign imaginaries. And one of the things I was observing there was that there's a recurring trope through popular music of Ukrainian renewal, and this is rooted in Ukrainian ideas of the folk, including the mythos of matriarchy. If you're familiar with Ruslana's catalog, you could probably assimilate that idea very easily. And this promise of Ukrainian self-actualization through popular music is something that we can see recurring arguably since 1991, and perhaps even earlier. In fact, Johann Gottfried Herder is on the record saying so back in the 18th century. So there's this discourse of renewal, but it is always framed as a binary choice between Europe or Russia. And what we were trying to show here in part through the media narratives is that Anglophone media narratives in particular are trying to slot these women into pre-existing narratives, especially about feminism, or to establish their identities as quote unquote European or Western. So in conclusion, we are witnessing how these powerful voices in the Ukrainian media sphere right now are challenging normative ideas of femininity, of class, of body politics, and of geopolitics, while remaining constrained in their subversive power through different structures, including the structures of the music industry, which is more lucrative in Europe and the West, perhaps, than in other directions they could face. But also in these powerful pre-existing narratives about gender, class, and geopolitics that have been defined as being either European, Western, or Russian, and something else. So we will just end there in the interest of time for today, and welcome any questions you might have during the Q&A.
Thank you both so much. Yeah, there's so much here. I feel like we need like a whole day to go through even just a few of these artists that we've touched on today. So we do have a question that came in from the YouTube channel, which is, I guess, have you done, or what do you think the difference would be if you did a word cloud of the Ukrainian media coverage of a figure like Alyona Alyona? Is it quite different? Like, is there, are you seeing that there's a distinction between sort of local coverage versus international coverage of her, or not, I guess?
Galina, do you want to speak to that? Or should I? Okay, I'll just say quickly, we tried to make a word cloud from the Ukrainian Russian, and maybe someone out there has a tip, but we weren't able to easily find a way to generate a word cloud based on those narratives. I think they probably would be somewhat different. I think some of the key terms, especially some of the more nuanced key terms, the more kind of contextual key terms just that don't appear in the Anglophone context might appear in a word cloud, but I imagine there would be substantial overlap as well. Yeah, do you want to add anything?
I think the difficulty for this was because we were working with both Russian and Ukrainian languages, because, like, for instance, for Alyona Alyona, one of her big interviews, which is quoted in Ukrainian media, was actually done with Russian journal. And so when you're trying to put the cloud for two different languages, it's really technically very different. And so also because there's like all those gendered endings that, so basically it just shows you that the most common words are and, no, and rap and woman, which we thought maybe is not sufficient. But I think that it could be quite interesting. We wanted to show some Cyrillics also on the screen just to add a little confusion maybe to those who don't speak Ukrainian or Russian. But yeah, this is something maybe for the future work.
Cool. So I have a question for both of you, for all of you. I know that all of you have worked on other genres of Ukrainian popular music at various points, whether that's folk music or rock. And I just wonder if you see anything that's unique about sort of either the way hip hop is being positioned in society now, or what you think its potential might be for opening up an outlet for certain groups that maybe aren't represented in other musics. I mean, what is your sort of impression of how this genre particularly fits amongst other Ukrainian popular music genres?
I could take just a little bit of this, only just going back, that hip hop was actually one of the first genres that allowed for more of an androgynous identity. So both young women and men wearing clothes bought in hip hop shops. This was also considered sort of a cosmopolitan way of engaging with the world. BMX biking, breakdancing, graffiti are all part of this. And so I think where this is going is fantastic, because this is really just a genre that anybody can participate in. I mean, whether you're thinking of African students, there are Koreans and rapping in Ukraine. There's Tatar musicians. So this is really one that is not limited. So for instance, when we're thinking of folk music revivals, there is a huge problem with that, because that actually limits by language, it limits by gender, it limits by appearance. And actually I just want to say that it would be interesting to see how Alyona's representation of body relates to generational representations of body, because she looks like older women or I mean, maybe not even older women, but there is an aesthetic of that type of body representation of women in Ukraine. So that's all I'll say, but thank you again for an excellent presentation.
I'll jump in quickly just to say that, you know, one of the things that I write about in my book is Dacha Bracha's Carpathian rap, which we didn't talk about today, but which became a kind of phenomenon, again, in its reception in the West. And that's mostly what I was writing about, is this idea, oh my gosh, Ukrainians are rapping, and also it's folkloric, right? And I think, if anything, it speaks to one of the points that Adriana made earlier, which is that some of the genre distinctions are maybe less critical at this particular juncture, probably not only in Ukraine, but in a lot of other contexts as well. And I think that one of the things that I continue to be really interested in are the ways in which these Ukrainian folk tropes, these like ethnose, are invoked through hip hop today, and the ways in which the linguistic politics of that are so particular, right? And I think hip hop globally has been has adapted itself to local vernaculars and has created entire new vocabularies. And I think part of what we see happening in Ukraine right now is that phenomenon continuing on.
Great. Well, we had two really amazing presentations. It's just about 5:30. So I will just say that if there are other questions, or if people are watching this YouTube stream after the fact, please feel free to email the Hunter Music Department, email me personally at the Hunter Music Department. And I presume, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I presume any of you would be happy also to receive questions after the fact, because this will stay up on our Hunter Music YouTube channel for a while. So congratulations. Thank you all for this really fascinating talk. I am now sort of percolating on like a Ukrainian hip hop conference